In July of 1518, in the streets of Strasbourg, a woman named Frau Troffea suddenly began to dance. She danced violently and uncontrollably without music and reason. Soon her daughter Fräulein Emma Gotz joined her, and the two danced through the street like mad women. It all began on July 14th, right outside Frau Troffea's home. They kept up this relentless dancing for a full week. Soon, others began to join them. First a few, then 3 dozen. Within days, dozens more were caught in the same uncontrollable dancing. By August, the phenomenon had grown beyond anyone's imagination. Around 400 people were dancing not just in the streets, but in private homes, and even in public halls. The dancing was far from joyous. It was a painful trance-like ordeal, with many dancing until their feet bled and they collapsed from sheer exhaustion. The victims' movements were violent and convulsive, with their bodies drenched in sweat. Their arms would thrash uncontrollably, with their eyes vacant and expressionless as they danced violently until they would eventually bleed into their shoes. Often the dancers would cry out for help, yet they could not stop dancing. As the number of dancers increased by the hundreds, the air in Strasbourg grew thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, and the air became thick with the fog of kicked-up dust. The city leaders were desperate. They needed a solution to stop this madness at once. They didn't turn to God, and they didn't turn to chains. Instead, they turned to the most respected physicians of the 16th century. The doctors examined the dancing victims and delivered a diagnosis that sounds like a death sentence called hot blood. They believed that the victims' blood had literally begun to boil inside their veins. According to the science of the time, the only way to cool the blood was to keep the bodies moving. They didn't need rest. They didn't need medicine. They needed to dance until the fever broke. In a move of pure bizarre madness, the city authorities didn't stop the plague. Instead, they encouraged more dancing. They cleared out the markets. They opened the great public halls. They even constructed a massive wooden stage in the center of the city. But the horror reached its peak when they hired professional musicians. The city believed the music would help the dancers exhaust the sickness. Instead, the music acted like fuel for an already blazing hot fire. The steady beating of the drums didn't cure the dancers. Instead, it synchronized them. Those who were on the verge of collapsing heard the beat and felt their muscles snap back into action. The music turned a chaotic scene into a choreographed nightmare. The stage became a literal slaughterhouse floor where the city paid musicians to play while the citizens danced their lives away. By the end of July, the city of Strasbourg had become a tomb of the living. The stages were filled with human waste and blood. The musicians who were hired to save the city now played with trembling hands, terrified of the very people they were supposed to cure. After realizing that science and music had failed, the city leaders reached a desperate conclusion. They concluded that this wasn't a disease of the blood, instead it was a curse of the soul. They believed the dancers had angered St. Vitus, who was an early Christian martyr known for his power over dance and epilepsy. The diagnosis had shifted from hot blood to divine punishment. To appease the saint, the city ordered a mass pilgrimage. The scene was a horror to behold. Hundreds of skeletal, jerking victims were rounded up and shoved into wooden wagons like livestock destined for the kill. They were carted miles away, high into the Vosges Mountains, to a damp, lightless shrine carved into a grotto. There, the priests forced the dancers to wear bright red shoes sprinkled with holy water and painted with crosses that had been blessed in the name of St. Vitus. The shoes were part of a religious, rather than medical, intervention aimed at stopping the uncontrollable dancing. In the shadows of that mountain cave, surrounded by the smell of damp earth and incense, the dancers looked like a cult of the damned. They weren't praying with their voices, they were praying with their agony, begging a stone statue to let their hearts finally stop, so they could finally have rest. After the failed experiments with stages and musicians, the spiritual cure at the shrine of St. Vitus was the only thing that seemingly worked to break the trance. After being forced to dance around the altar of St. Vitus in their blood-stained footwear, the surviving dancers reportedly felt the heavy fever lift from their minds. History records that within a few weeks of these pilgrimages, the relentless twitching finally began to fade. To the priests and the people of 1518, it was a divine miracle. At the height of the plague, the dancers were no longer people, they were walking corpses. Their joints began to pop and grind as the fluid between their bones dried up. Muscles tore away from the skeleton, yet the victims who were trapped in a trance didn't even flinch. They simply kept moving and kept on dancing. Some sources claim that for a period the plague killed around 15 people per day, but the sources of the city of Strasbourg at the time of the events did not mention the number of deaths, or even if there were any fatalities. These weren't peaceful deaths. People were suffering massive, explosive heart attacks while dancing. Their faces would turn a deep, bruised purple as they gasped for air that their lungs could no longer process. Others suffered strokes that paralyzed half their bodies. Yet witnesses claimed their remaining limbs continued to twitch and claw at the air in a grotesque, half-dead rhythm. Most of the dancers died from sheer agonizing exhaustion. Some died of dehydration. Most died because their brains had effectively disconnected from their bodies, until the very organ that literally kept them alive eventually burst. The streets of Strasbourg weren't filled with music anymore. They were filled with the sound of silence, and the question that still haunts historians today: what kind of invisible monster could hijack a human mind and force it to kill itself in the most public, painful way possible? As the last of the dancers collapsed and the silence returned to Strasbourg, the world was left with a haunting question: why? Modern science has tried to peel back the layers of this 500-year-old nightmare, and the answers they've found are just as terrifying as the curse itself. The leading medical theory is a phenomenon called ergotism. In the 16th century, rye was a staple of the poor man's diet. But in damp years, a toxic fungus called Claviceps purpurea can grow on the grain. When consumed, this fungus releases chemicals similar to LSD. However, critics argue that ergot poisoning, also known as St. Anthony's fire, usually causes gangrene or hallucinations rather than sustained coordinated dancing and would not last for weeks. The leading theory suggests that the plague was caused by mass psychogenic illness, also known as mass hysteria, with extreme social, religious, and economic stress, combined with starvation and diseases like syphilis. This mass hysteria was likely triggered by the intense fear of a curse from St. Vitus, who was believed to afflict sinners with dancing. The event, which saw people dance until they collapsed from exhaustion or died of strokes and heart attacks, is often cited as a prime example of how intense community distress can manifest physically. The dancing plague of 1518 remains one of the most terrifying reminders of how little we truly understand about the human mind. Whether it was the fire of a toxic fungus or a collective snap into madness, for one summer in Strasbourg, the rhythm was a death sentence. If you found this deep dive into history's most bizarre horrors unsettling, hit that like button, and if you want to see more cases like this, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss our next dive into the archives of the unexplained.